I know, I mean, every time I look at that thing, I just get, I'm trying to keep this relevant to you quilters, and I'll describe materials at the end. And I recount the life of a woman who happens to be an ancestor of mine, but her story is the story of Oregon pioneers. I'm the keeper of her story, but the story is really about the westward migration of this country from colonial times to the present. So as she said, my name is Annice, but I travel under Olena. Mary Louisa is my great-grandmother, and somebody in my family has paid taxes and voted in Jackson County for 150 years. I always think that's kind of cool. I grew up here, and like most of my classmates, I beat a hasty retreat out of here in the 1960s. I sometimes say that I think Southern Oregon's biggest export is its high school seniors. Yeah. And my parents remained living in Jackson County on Forest Creek. Both were active members of the Historical Society and the Genealogy Society. And in 2007, I looked at my mom's files and decided that if I didn't keep track of them, they'd be discarded. So I gave myself a retirement project. And this presentation is dedicated to my mother, Marguerite Watson Black. And I also have been going to Oregon Shakespeare Festival, and they always have this thing at the beginning where they honor the Shasta and the Tequilma people. We're on the lands of the Native Americans who had this spot before we did. So what was the purpose of a quilt like this? The purpose of a quilt like this was a memory quilt. It was a fashion during the 1860s to mark milestones, births, marriages, relocating. We're pretty sure that this was made by Mary Louisa's mothers. That would be both her mother's mother, her mother, and her husband's mother, and sisters and cousins, but of course we don't know. A quilt as a gift has an interesting, you know, when you lay down at night, you have the love and compassion of your friends and family that you left behind and would never see again, to give you the strength to do your duty for the daily trials and tribulations of an arduous journey. How about that for a little, oh, I didn't flip the page, did I? So because this is a genealogy, I thought I would go mucking around in the ancestry, and this was really great because Ancestry.com is an amazing tool. Now, of course, that's so far away you can't read it, but you can tell that Mary Louisa's, oops, come on, okay, get the buttons right. This is Mary Louisa, parents, grandparents, all 4 of her grandparents, and all 8 of her great-grands. And I found those within about 2 hours using Ancestry.com, the little leaves. Now, yeah, I had a little bit of a head start because in the 1980s, my mother and a woman by the name of Natalie Black published the Black family history in a book called, I don't know, I'll repeat it later. And that gave me a head start. And also there's a really fun story about this stem that sticks back out here, and I won't talk about it in this presentation, it'll save it for some other, but that's a great piece of yes, the recompense leek. You got those in your tree? Oh, I got a story for you. Okay, so anybody who uses Ancestry will recognize this piece of how it looks on the screen. I just borrowed that, and then I stuck down here the names of her children. John Maupin, and they married in 1865. And John's pedigree isn't as impressive. I didn't have all 8 great-grandparents. But John's great-grandfather, her husband, Samuel Black, came to the colonies in probably 1835, plus or minus. And he was a Presbyterian minister, and in the early 1700s, that was kind of a rebellion movement, saying that each person had their own right to God. And So the history of him and all his descendants is called Pioneer Preacher, Descendants of Samuel Black, 1700 to 1770, of Pennsylvania and Albemarle County, Virginia. Of all of Mary Louisa's 5 children, only Lee had descendants. So Myrtilla Baker, where's Myrtilla? Oops, come on, I'll learn to manage this thing in a minute. Myrtilla and the last one, Martha, lived to be adults and had no children. Now, there is one thing that I can now complain about Ancestry.com, and that is that it has no count for descendants. So you'd like to put in, their name and get how many blood kin they got. So I printed out the report and counted, and she has 103 descendants, and if you take out her immediate family and just do Lee, her son, he has 99. And I got a hunch by now there's a couple of other stems on there. So this, she was literate. This was written by my mother about Mary Louisa. She had good common school education. Her grammar was good, her spelling a little less so, but her penmanship was excellent. And here's some entries. AD 1863, August 7th. Sally is 4 years old today and is spelling. AD 1864, August 7th, a year later. Sally has finished reading her first reader through the second time and has spelled through the spelling book. So not only was Marilee teaching her small daughter to read, she was also teaching their Negro slave to read and write. According to her descendants, she accepted the Negroes as human beings of worth, especially June, the household servant girl. Don't have any more information, would love to do some more research. And that is from the introduction to the book that Mother published of the diary. It's called Oregon Overland Trail. It's sitting up here on the, I have one copy and it's the desk copy, so. Why go to Oregon? Well, because they had an aunt and uncle that were already here. But I think their immigration was also fueled by the political and terrorism that was going on in Missouri in the 1860s. Those of you who died in Missouri. So of course, that wonderful internet, I'm nosing around and I find this 4-volume series published in 2014. And of course it's in digital format, so I can stick in names and start looking for Isaac Black or John Maupin or McRoberts. But I had to focus on writing this presentation, so I didn't go much further than that. But let me read a introduction here. For over a century and a half, the vicious guerrilla warfare of the Civil War in Missouri has haunted American history. The war's famous battles with huge armies slaughtering each other on the American fields and forests, Gettysburg, were horrific. But guerrilla warfare in Missouri makes the blood run cold. Gangs of men on horseback, formerly peaceful farmers, rode in the night to pillage and burn down their unarmed neighbors in cornfields and country lanes. It continued throughout the war as pro-Confederate guerrillas harassed federal troops, state militia, and terrorized citizens who supported the Union. So, we have the Flintlock Rifle incident. So we have some relics from this trip. We have, this is a Flintlock Rifle, and Mary Louisa's father, so this came through the McRoberts, had brought this gun from Ohio. So she was born in Ohio, they moved to Missouri when she was about 15. Isaac McRoberts had brought this gun from Ohio, and on the barrel is inscribed B. Samples, 1848. A plate on the stock reads J. Langdon Layton, Dayton. The gun came with a bullet mold, a shot pouch, and a powder horn. All of those are still in existence in the family. I think they're in the possession of my brother. And the stock, it had been cracked and been mended. So right up here, that's a patch on the stalk, a metal band. So here's the story that's handed down in the family. Isaac Jr., so this would be Sarah's, this would be Mary Louisa's brother, was living with them on the John Black on John's parents' place. And on one such foray, young Isaac took the muzzle loader and was gone several weeks. When he came back, he was wounded and the stock of the gun was broken. Family records show he only partially recovered from this incident by being bothered, quotes, by his wound for the rest of his life. And that's in page 17, 18, 19 of that introduction. So they're getting ready for the trip, and John's father passed away and left them his property in Missouri, which they promptly sold and moved, stocked up, sold everything. They sold the property to fund the trip, and they started with 2 wagons and all their worldly goods, having sold or given away everything else. They brought with them the quilt, grub box. Later on I'll talk about some of the things that we still have from this trip. So then tragedy strikes, and somewhere between Paris and Shelbina in Monroe County, there's no mention of this in the diary. There's only the following entry in the family Bible. Sally Black, daughter of J.M. and M.L. Black, died May 1st, A.D. 1865, age 5 years, 8 months, 24 days. So the story that's told by the family lore, is that they were camped by a train of freight wagons. So they're leaving their home, they're on the way to where the wagon train is going to start, and they're camped overnight. And she visited the Teamster's cook tent, where she apparently ate some spoiled food. She became violently ill and died within hours. It's assumed that she's buried somewhere in an unmarked grave. Mary Louisa and John continued, but in grief, onward to Council Bluff. There was no turning back. So that's quoted from my mother's journal entry. So she's got a baby that was born in January 1st, I guess, in 1865. So she's nursing a 3-month-old baby. She's got a 3-year-old, and she's about to embark on a walk for 2,000 miles. So about a few days after the wagon train headed up and headed out, she started making diary entries. And diary, I have a facsimile of it, but I think my brother's got the real deal. So Mary Louisa started this diary, and the wagon train that they joined up with in Missouri, in Council Bluffs. So Council Bluffs, Iowa. And the train had 109 wagons and was under the leadership of James T. Kirk. And yes, indeed, we think that Gene Roddenberry was one of his descendants, and he named Captain Kirk of the Starship Enterprise after the wagon master of their wagon train. So this is a replica of it, and I'm like, what am I going to do for this page? What am I going to do for this page? So finally, I just flipped the thing open and said, I'll show you some of her handwriting. And I just flipped it open, took a picture, started to put it in here, and I went, oh my God, what am I got here? So this is a quote from June 29th, 1865, and I'm sure you can't read it, so I'll read it to you. Soon after we halted, a soldier came riding up for the doctor of our train to go back to the next station to take an arrow out of a man's back. The man lives at the station, has been hunting for them, I assume he's talking about the Indians, for a number of years. It was done right in the rear of our train by some Arapahoes who shook hands with him, pretending friendly, and when he turned to leave, they shot him. The arrow passed through his lung, doctor says. The same Indians that visited our camp Sunday Eve are the authors of this mischief. Near as we can learn, the hunter knew them. So you could lead that a lot of different ways, couldn't you? So here's the trek. And I didn't spend a lot of time going through all of the numbers of the details, but I kind of tried to get the major events that you know how long it took. So they left about May 11th, Council Bluffs, Iowa. By July 6th, they were crossing the North Platte River. And then they were crossing the Continental Divide on July 12th. And that's real easy to tell because when you get to the top, some of the creeks go one way and some of the creeks go down the hill the other side. And you know you're at the Continental Divide. They got to the Utah-Idaho state line by August 4th and 5th. So not quite 3 or 4 weeks to get all the way across there. And then they crossed the Snake, and that marks them getting into Oregon. And along in the diary, she talks about what they had to pay for ferry rides and what they had to pay for fording and who was sick and what got lost. And then in September 22nd, they did not ferry down the Columbia. They did it by land and went up over what is called the Barlow Road. So those of you who know your Oregon Trail history know that that's the last leg. It was very steep, and she has a harrowing discussion in there about how they almost lost a wagon over the edge. So once they got to the mouth of the Willamette River, they still had 300 miles to go. They had to come all the way from the Willamette River down to southern Oregon. And there's notes in there where she doesn't make an entry for several weeks, and they ask for her Uncle Joe, Josh Hanna, and his son Isaac were sent for to come get them. And then the destination, so they got here, and if you know where Dodge Bridge is out across the Rogue River,
yes.
If you go upriver from that, that's where this Hanna's, and there's still Hanna family, that's where this location is that they were coming to. At Sam's Valley. My mom, when we would go over Sexton Mountain, I was learning to drive, and I-5 was just getting built and they were making the cut. But up at the top of the cut, you could still see the road, part of the road, the cut for the road of the wagon road. And she made this comment, which sticks with me today. She said, every time I look up there, in my imagination, I can see those wagons pulling up that hill with the sound of the harnesses jangling as they came over that pass. My mom's a historian, isn't she? So this is the next piece of tragedy. And this is a letter sent to Mary Louisa by her mother, and it's dated May 4th, 1867. I know you came here to hear about this old quilt, but I'm telling you all about this lady's life, which is a little difficult at times, and every time I say this story, I get really emotional. So, yep, another kid died. So this is her letter's mother, and I know you can't probably read it, so let me read. It says, at home, May 4th, 1867. This is written by her mother. My dear children, your letter of March 20th came by yesterday mail, bearing the sad news of the death of your little son Clifton. You know, your mother and all at home sympathize with you. And it goes on for another page. So baby Clifton died of diphtheria, something today that, you know, DPT shots would have taken care of. And we don't know where the body is buried. We don't have a grave for him. So after walking 2,000 miles, enduring the grieving of the death of her first child, and then losing the baby she was nursing, she lived another 38 years to die of old age at 76. Okay. So now maybe we'll talk about the quilt. We'll just move on, like oftentimes we do, to go talk about something else because it's tough. So this quilt, or a quilt like it, there's a treasures in the trunk up here. by Mary Bywater Cross. There's one that's similar to it, and it's called Wagon Wheels. And as soon as I saw that, I thought, yeah, look at these things moving as if they're rolling along. And I don't know how many of you have seen wagons going by in a parade sometime in the past. And that center hub, and then there's the light you can see between the spokes, and then there's the spokes and the tips. And this is the only one that's light. All the rest of these have a dark, so that you see that. And then here's the rim. So I looked in the Encyclopedia of Pieced Quilts, which seems to be the Mother Bible. Patterns by Barbara Brackman. And this pattern block was not in there. There is ones that she would identify this as stars. And it wouldn't be wheels, because in her the wheels had circles in the center. Now I tried to get one big enough that you can kind of see the detail. And all of these star pieces, all of these pieces are made up of what I started calling parallelograms. And if you make a parallelogram with the right thing, you wind up with these diamond shapes. So getting those points, yeah, right. Anybody, you know how tough that is to get those points. And the use of the colors, brown, green, that yellow, were popular textiles in the 1860s. And thank you, Maureen, for loaning me a big patch of books on quilting from this era. And is that me? No. Okay. All right, so here's a little detail on each one. So this is the center here. I'm emphasizing the center. I guess I could have blown that up. So there's 6 pieces. All the pieces in this, all these pieces are the same size. There's just two sizes of pieces in this quilt. And that diamond shape. And then this next, I keep calling it a row, and I keep calling it a block. I'm sure if anybody's around here who's a technical quilter could tell me, no, that's called a whatever. But the next radius out, and there's 12 pieces of that yellow, and that's consistent all the way across. Every block has those 12 pieces of yellow. And then the next row out from the center is calico. And this calico varies on every single star, and these points. Now, one of the things I haven't done is stood here and said, this point is also in this wheel. I didn't get there, but partly because I'm reluctant to lay this quilt out until I get someplace where I have a really nice large table that it can lay on comfortably, and it then the outer block are these points. There's 2 greens, and that's consistent across the entire quilt. And then, of course, the points are, we think it's funny about this one pink. And it's right there. I don't know if I should be shining the light on there, but that's that pink. It doesn't look like they had very much of it. And the white areas, and you know, anybody who's a quilter, that leaf stitch, you know, getting the quilt frame where you can lean across there and make that curve time after time without killing your back. I was like, oh, that's this is made by people in the 1860s. Yeah. So this is another attempt to let you see the back, and I did get out a ruler, and it's about 9 stitches to the inch. And so this is a detail to talk about the calico. Where did they get the calico? I mean, look at the quality of the printing of this. And this is during the Civil War. This is, they weren't so primitive, were they? We think of this as a long time ago, but the quality of this calico is just fabulous. So I did a little research, of course. I had this wonderful time of digging into things, and Mexico, Missouri is the county seat of where they were, right? So I don't know where their town, but a town was nearby. And there'd been a railroad that had been put in 1856, opened in 1856. I've got that number in here wrong. So I figured they must have had a dry goods store where they could get bolts of fabric, how much they had to pay for it. Oh, and it was the Wabash. It was a Wabash Railroad, so of course I'd walk around humming a Wabash Cannonball for a couple days. And I was wondering if maybe they got, or who got this pattern out of a newspaper, but the Mexico Daily Ledger paper, which was started in 1855, burned, and newspaper.coms didn't have any issues from this era. But there was somebody who was talking around me and said, you know, there's another paper in that area that was where they had a lot of syndication of quilt patterns. Okay, so then I started asking about how, you know, we've got a quilt going here, we've got fabric, and the material in this quilt is not homespun. Okay, so homespun is the classic spinning wheel. You see the spinning wheel, and lots of weavers still do that. They had a hand loom, and they would weave that cloth into cloth and make clothes out of it. That was homespun, lasted for centuries. And much of that piecework was done as paid homework, paid in the homework. People would be paid to spin spindles, and then they would give them to larger groups. So it was homework. And as cotton became industrialized, that work went away. So there's a huge disruption to women's economy from the colonies to the early 1840s and on. Huge disruption. And it changed the American economy, and the cloth got more affordable. In the 1700s, cotton was a privileged cloth, and only the wealthy, a few average people could afford it. So the economy went through a huge transformation, and I was just fascinated by the development. So here we are enduring this huge cultural and social change brought around by computers and electronics. And I was listening to a podcast by a woman historian, let me see, where's her name? Anyway, she made the same comment. She was a historian, she was talking about Lincoln, and she said, you know, he endured a social and technical disruption every bit as much like what we're going through right now. Our culture is changing, the way we get understanding. Jobs are going to go away because of automation, robots, and this was happening between the 1840s and the 1860s in these states in the eastern part, which the West hadn't been developed yet. They were just beginning to settle up, starting in the 1850s, California and the West. And also, geography matters. So why didn't the Southerners have their own textile mills? Well, they didn't have fast-running streams, and you needed a fast-running stream to run the wheels, the paddle wheels that ran the factories. And in the South, they had that long plain of that long plain that was what was called the Atlantic Plain, the Piedmont, and also Mississippi Valley. Large flat area where it'd be easy to grow large tracts of cotton or crops. And the cotton in this quilt was probably grown by slaves. That's kind of a sad thought. And I got this out of a Frank's Illustrated newspaper. The search for it was a great trip. Anyway, plantation overseers were experienced. So they started this influx of growing cotton in the 1790s when the cotton gin. By 1810, it was profitable. And they developed the plantation system, which made owning slaves an important part of keeping that economy going. They were exporting this stuff to England, and the mills in the north were able to get cotton. And here's, I don't know how much of this you can see, but this is a graphic, and they're talking about, here's picking, here's shipping, here's running the gaining, where they take the seeds out, and then this is called ginning, where they get the fiber, the little tail off of the, I don't know how many people have seen milkweed, but you know that pod that comes out of milkweed and there's little seeds in it, and then those stringers? The stringers is what is the cotton. That's the fiber. And then they're packing it and then shipping it off. And I got curious about how did they get it from the south to the north? Well, they used steam paddle boats. And the earliest examples of a steam paddle boat going all the way into the New England states by paddle boat. And the reason that they didn't ship it to England in steamships was because the steamship, to get all the way across the Atlantic, couldn't carry enough coal. So steamships crossing the Atlantic didn't happen until the 1870s. So more things you need to know about cotton. And of course, here's a example, and of course that little text box up there, you can't probably read it. So water was channeled to the mill wheel. So water's channeled to this gizmo, and turn that mill wheel, and it's a large wooden cylinder with angled paddles. And as the water's rushing down the stream, it turns the paddle wheel. And then these belts enable it, that's called the main drum. And those belts then, you can see them going up to these long metal shafts on each floor. And then there's individual small gears and belts that transfer the power to the individual spindles or looms. And at the start, in these factories in the north, was women laborers. And there's a famous story about the Lowell factories and the Lowell Girls. And Lowell decided that those workers would be great. He gave them dormitories and made sure that they were protected so that their parents didn't feel worried about sending single girls off to a foreign place. They sent their money back home. And this was another relief for all those spinners who couldn't spin at home anymore. They had another way to get economic wealth. But of course, it's only for the New England states. That's why there was a... And by the 1840s, the Lowell Girls had a couple strikes, women strikers, and of course the mill workers, the mill owners trying to kill them off. Trying to end it. By the 1860s, the factory labor changed in those mills. And they started bringing in immigrants, hiring the immigrants that were just coming in from Europe. And the working conditions deteriorated further, and by the 1860s you have the sweatshops, child labor, and it took until the 30s to undo the child labor that started in this era. And by the 1860s, these mills had the kinks worked out so that they were able to produce really good quality cloth. And I want to yell back at them from this far away and say, hey, psst, it worked. So this will give you an idea, this will give you an idea of calico printing. So the calico, so they'd make the cloth, and then they had these blocks of dyes. Now this is from 1835. This is a little earlier. This graphic was done in 1835. Another innovation was called the mercerization. I don't know how many of you buy mercerized thread. Well, what mercerized thread is its cotton is treated with sodium hydroxide or caustic soda to swell the fibers and increase the fiber's luster, as well as its affinity for dye by increasing the surface area of the fiber lint. So that's what mercerized thread is. Yeah, me too. I didn't know that. It also improved the way that the dye stayed in the fabric. And this quilt is a testament to the quality of their processes. They were getting pretty good at this. And then, so by the 1860s, they could grow good cotton. I talked a little bit about what change this was, what a disruption it was to the economy. I mean, there's all kinds of disruptions in here. The beginning of steamships, so that they were able to move goods around. They had railroads. They were able to use steam for running railroads. They changed the way people earned their living. And of course, there is the Civil War and the emancipation of slaves and the breakup of the plantation system. And anyway, I just think it's kind of, So, now I'm just going to start changing my topic here and start moving on to talking about the storage. You know, it's great that it was built, but how did I get it here? How did we wind up with something? So one is it's always been in a trunk. There's a couple places on the edge, and there's one spot. The pink block has a spot. Yeah, the pink block has a spot, which I think was at the bottom of the trunk and is where the fold was, and the bottom of the trunk got wet somewhere, somehow. So when Mary Louisa and John got to Oregon in 1865, 66, she had with her a bunch of hickory nuts, and she planted the hickory nut. So there's the hickory nut, 164, 100, no, I guess it's not 100. There's the hickory nut. So that tree is on your way out to Shady Cove at about the 18-mile marker. If you look over on the river side of the road, of course I don't have a picture of Mary Louisa in her, but this was right near where the house was. Now, in the meantime, there's an electrical power line that goes over the top, and it's next to an asphalt road, which didn't exist at the time the tree was planted. And so this is my way of saying Quilt lived in that house with them until probably about 1908, when Lee, my grandfather, left living out by the Rogue River and moved up Forest Creek. Sorry, I didn't mean to go up that. And Lee's wife, Helen, was of Norwegian ancestry, and they built a cellar. Now, down in this part is a cement room, right? Tall enough to stand in. And then they put this building on top. And I had a better picture that showed it more architecturally, but I thought this was much more romantic about how much the vines grew up over it. And all the time I was a kid, this area was called overhead the cellar. And that's where all the trunks and the stuff was left. I'm always very proud of my dad, who went out and got, during World War II, corrugated aluminum and put it up on roofs, and it made a very watertight, waterproof, so it didn't leak, didn't run water down in it. And the bottom was used to store canned goods before electricity. You can see that in the meantime, there's electricity that's gone to this building, probably the 1960s anyway. And then in the 1970s, my mom and dad dug out a basement underneath the house. And you can see there's the freezers, and it was kind of a bomb shelter and a nuclear bomb shelter and extra storage. But my first awareness of this quilt was in the 1990s. And I was trying to go through and do a, you know, Mom, what do we got left from the wagon train? What's left? And I found, I think, about 8 items. There was the grub box, which was the box that was behind the wagon, the wagon seat in the back. There's a box behind, they called it the grub box. And they put the day's supplies of food in it. There was an oxbow, there was this quilt, there was the family Bible, there was the gun, and a diary. And I hadn't heard of this quilt. I thought, I've heard of the guns. Everybody talks about the guns, big deal about the guns. So when my parents died in 2007, I got it in an acid-free box and brought it to my house, and it lives with me. And in the summer, the AC keeps it at an even temperature, and in the winter I've got heat that keeps the house at an even temperature. So one of these things that they say about preserving fabrics is if you can keep them in a range, both temperature-wise and humidity, and this one seems to be doing pretty good. And I would say that these trunks seem to have an ability to absorb or do something with moisture, and they keep it pretty even inside. So what are some of the benefits of, you know, that's the best I can tell you about what it took to keep the fabric and the quilt's integrity. And by cracky, I'm getting there. So in 2014, I brought the quilt in for Quilt Registration Day. And the next one is going to be October 29th, 2018, if you have family quilts or historic quilts that ought to be registered. And there's all the reasons for doing it. And that's all, folks. Thank you.
Probably my great-grandma and my great-great-grandma, and then another sister somewhere. Right. Some assortment of great.
Oddball. We have found meeting up to talk about meeting up.
I told you about each other.
I know they do.
What is she doing? Taking a
Straight lines that when you take out, they're straight because they went with it.
I am just to figure out how they I'm not an experienced how they put it, how she put it.